QSO Today, episode 509, Will Harris, KI4POV. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on this week's show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur callsign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I am traveling back to Israel for about 3 days this week, so I will mention new listener sponsors and donations for 2 weeks in next week's episode. Please show some love and support by making your donation today. We are commercial-free and rely on listeners to pony up and contribute to keeping QSO Today on the air. Will Harris, KI4POV, followed in his father's footsteps from his junior workbench alongside his dad's to become a licensed ham at age 12. While Will did not pursue an engineering career, he has become a prolific home builder in the tradition of Doug DeMaw, W1FB, and Wes Hayward, W7ZOI. KI4POV discussed his wideband homebrew transceiver and the rest of his ham radio story in this QSO Today. KI4POV, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Will?
4Z1UG, this is KI4POV. Yes, Eric, I'm here.
Will, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this since you emailed me. It really starts for me with my dad. I don't really remember a time when I wasn't around electronics and radio of some sort. My dad is an electrical engineer here in the Huntsville, Alabama area where I still live. So really, I guess to tell you my start, I kind of have to give some explanation of his start to give some background. He got his ticket in mid-70s. I don't know the year exactly, but he is WB4 WWD, got his novice ticket, and was very active in building and tinkering during his childhood, and so that very much translated as he started raising me. I think he tried to transfer some of those things. So some of my earliest memories are when I was 4, 5, 6 years old. He would bring home just used consumer electronics, so cassette players and VCRs and things of that nature. And we had a shop where he would work on and tinker with stuff. And I had a little bench in the back where that was my space. And so he gave me a set of screwdrivers and would give me things like that and say, here, take this apart or take that apart. And it was a very interesting experience, very educational. I tore up a lot of stuff. But I learned some things, and that was a lot of fun. And gradually it kind of transferred. It started out, of course, when you're 4 and 5, I was mostly interested in pulling out the DC motors and things like that. I'd pull the motors out and hook them to batteries and turn little fans and things. But I got more and more interested in the electrical side of it. That was about the same age that he helped me build a crystal radio and a cigar box. And also out in that same shop house, he had an old Hallicrafters S38 shortwave receiver. And I remember a lot of nights when we were out there working on things that I would sit over at the bench with that S38. And we grew up on a small farm, and so we had an electrical fence that ran around our pasture. And for our antenna, we would unhook the fence charger and connect the antenna to that electrical fence, and that was our long wire. And I remember listening to shortwave stations all over the world, sitting there on a bench while he worked on stuff, and that was a great introduction. And even things like this was mid-2000s for context, so I know a lot of this sounds very much like some of your other guests, except that this, for me, it happened about 30 years later than a lot of them. But in the mid-2000s, he would get on this website called Heavens Above, I believe is what it was called, and it had info on when satellites and the space station would come over. And so he would write down the times, and we would get out the same S38 and listen to WWV and get our time exactly right. And when we were within 30 seconds, we'd run out of the shop door and right at dusk and catch satellites and space station coming over. So it was a really neat childhood. It was a really neat way to grow up, and he really invested a lot of time and effort into fostering that for me.
Now, did you have siblings as well?
I did. I have one sister.
Was she as interested? Did she have a bench also in the garage?
No, she did not get that gene. She had other interests. She's a very talented piano player and does a lot of other things, but she had other interests. And I think she tended to shadow my mom more than she did my dad.
It's my understanding that you're also a musician. Do you come from a family of musicians in addition to electronics types?
I do. My dad's family especially is very musical, and so I don't know if I'd call myself a musician, but I can play a little bit of piano and guitar and banjo and mandolin and several different things, and that's very enjoyable. That's a good way to relieve stress.
Well, you wouldn't call yourself a musician, but you just said you play 4 instruments.
Well, I play at 4 instruments anyway.
I can sympathize with that. I think I do the same. I play at 3 instruments. So what happened as you got older and you entered junior and high school? Did you become involved in more radio or computers? What was the interest there?
Yeah, both actually. So that was what I was describing was early and mid-elementary. And by the time I was in 4th or 5th grade, I think that was about the time that I really became aware of ham radio. Of course, I'd kind of stumbled across some of that tuning through the shortwave bands. And Dad would say, those are hams. And you would try to listen. But of course, the S38 was pretty broad, and especially for CW and SSB, not really suited for that. But you could hear a little bit. But about that time is when he pulled down his old rig, which was it was a Heathkit HW8 that he had built after he got his ticket. And I remember he helped me put a long wire up in the house, and we ran a wire up to the ceiling and crossed the rafters in the attic. And he set up his Helicopters Heathkit HW8 on my desk, and that was the first time I really remember listening to the ham bands. And I remember him tuning through in the CW bands and copying some code, and that was amazing. I thought that was the coolest thing that he actually could do that. And so he pulled out a box of old straight keys and helped me rig up a straight key with a NE555 timer for the code practice oscillator, and started helping me learn the code. And so it felt like it took forever to learn code. I was about 10, 11, and so it didn't stick very well with me, but I did eventually manage to get code down. And about the same time, he got me the technician license manual from the ARRL and started helping me go through that. And I studied and worked on it off and on for a couple of years, and eventually ended up getting my ticket in early summer of 2006. And so when I got that was the technician license. And at this time, of course, you still had the code requirements. So I got the technician license with the 5-word per minute code endorsement, which was really what I was looking for, because that was the ticket to get on the old novice bands. And so got on the air, and at this time, the novice band ran from 7.1 to 7.15 on 40 meters, which was my primary band at the time. And so it was a different time. I mean, this is nearly 20 years ago now, but there was a lot more AM broadcast on the band at that time. So it was rough going in those old novice bands, especially at night. It was pretty tough, but that was a lot of fun.
How old were you when you got your technician license in 2006, can I ask?
I was 12 years old. Summer after I got out of 6th grade was when I got it.
And your call sign was the KI4POV?
Yes, that's my original call sign. I've never changed it.
There was no N for novice. Oh, no, it was a technician class. So, yeah, KI4POV.
Right. So this is after the novice license had become defunct. They had gotten rid of that. But like I say, still doing the old novice bands.
The HW8 had a reputation for having kind of a very broad front end. But being out on a farm, I guess you didn't have a noise problem.
Well, not really. Not like the kind of noise that we have now, at least. But yes, it's broad as a barn door, wide open. And especially with the broadcast bands, did not handle AM broadcast interference very well at all. But By this time, I had actually changed rigs, so the HW8 was not my primary rig by the time I got my ticket.
And what was that first rig then?
So the first rig was thanks to a good friend in Elmer, some guy that I'm still in contact with named Mike Fanning, in the K4GU. He was a coworker of my dad and a very good CW op. And he had an old ICOM 751 that had been a former rig that he had and offered it to us for a very, very good price. It was trying to help us out. And so after I got my ticket, my dad bought that for me. And we set that up. And so that was my first real rig after I got my ticket.
So you're operating 40-meter CW in the novice band. And what kind of antenna did you use?
So the antenna was a in-fed long wire off the back of the house. It was running between our house and a pine tree down at the edge of the woods, just a little ways off. And it worked very well because it was not the in-fed half wave that people use now that has the impedance converter at the end, the transformer at the end. So what we did instead was we had a run of coax from my room out to the outside, and we actually had a remote external antenna tuner mounted on the outside of the house as an L match and fed the long wire directly from that tuner. So that was a great antenna. I worked the world on that, on 40 meters and even 30 and 20 later on after I upgraded. So that was a lot of fun. That was a great setup, really.
As a teenager, did you collect some operating awards like DXCC or anything like that? 50 states?
No, I was never that serious in operating. I would generally get on at night after I finished homework, and I would make one or two CW contacts, but I was not trying to work all states or get DXCC. As a matter of fact, for 40 meters at that time, the bands were not particularly hot then, as I remember. And you could work most of the Midwest and sometimes on a good night, even out to the West Coast, running 100 watts. But later on, when I started running digital, I don't ever remember working a lot of really exotic DX on CW, especially up in the novice band. Now, after I upgraded, that got a little better, but the novice band, like I say, was pretty rough going at the time.
Well, it seems to me with a technician class license, even with the Morse code endorsement or the CW endorsement, that you could have operated voice. Why didn't you go right to voice modes?
That's a good question. Voice was just never, I don't know, it was never my thing. Dad was never a big voice op. He was a CW op the whole time he was active. I dabbled a little in voice. I did some 2-meter FM. I think everybody kind of goes through that phase. You get on the local repeater and see what that's all about. But it wasn't really my thing. I just found that the kind of conversations that I was having on CW, the kind of people I was meeting, was more in line with what I was looking to do. And plus, of course, as I got a little older and started getting more into the homebrewing and building process, CW is much easier to build for. And so that kind of kept me in CW later on.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career post-high school?
I would like to say that it did, but honestly, not as much as I would have hoped. So I grew up at a rural high school, and I didn't have a strong background in math. Somewhat foolishly convinced myself, I think, that I didn't have the math background needed to do something like engineering, which is really what I would have liked to have done. And at the same time in high school, I started working at a local pharmacy in my hometown, and I was just running a cash register, and I started the job just for the purpose of having gas money. And I decided that I liked it. It was good work, and it was interesting. You get to meet a lot of people and see a lot of things, and I enjoyed the people interaction part of it. And the man that I was working for, an elderly gentleman who was the pharmacist there, offered to kind of encourage me to pursue that when he saw that I had some interest. So that's actually what I ended up doing. I graduated high school in 2012 and went to Auburn University. So here in Alabama, there were two pharmacy schools. There's Auburn, and then there's Sanford, which is a private school in Birmingham. But of course, I didn't have private school money, but I was able to get a scholarship, fortunately, to Auburn. And so I went to Auburn and did my undergrad there in biomedical science, and then got into their pharmacy program and I got my doctorate in pharmacy from Auburn.
And did the old guy sell you the pharmacy when he retired?
He didn't sell it to me, but I actually still work at the same pharmacy, yes.
As a pharmacist behind the counter?
That's right. So I tell people I've done everything there. I've ran a cash register and cleaned toilets and vacuumed floors, and now I'm actually behind the counter filling. So it's been kind of a full circle process for me.
So you're actually in the same town that you grew up in, and family ties, the whole 9 yards, huh?
Yeah, I am. So my wife and I came back from college, and we both had family in this area, and so we moved back here. And yeah, we were fortunate enough, blessed to be able to find a place here and come back. And it was never a sure thing that I'd be able to come back and work in the same pharmacy, but been very blessed, and it's worked out very well that's kind of fell into place for me. Providence.
It seems to me that being a pharmacist is an ideal job for somebody who has an interest in amateur radio and especially in home brewing, because I think being a pharmacist is the kind of job that when you lock the door and you go home at night, you're not on call necessarily.
That's the way it's worked out for me. That certainly depends on what branch of pharmacy you go into, but that's maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit in the story, but yes, that's been one of the benefits, is that when I close the door at night and lock up, I'm pretty much done for the day. All the business happens during normal business hours, so it really frees me up at night mostly for family things at this point. But yes, I do get more bench time than I would have otherwise with other jobs.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about that now. It's my understanding from the research that I did that you probably took a little bit of a break from ham radio when you were pursuing college. That seems quite understandable. Is that how it went?
I did. Yeah, so I was active all the way through high school. I should back up a little bit. As I got into high school, I was very active in digital modes. You asked about computers earlier. I have some background in computer programming, and so I dabbled a lot in computers and got into digital modes. PSK31 was very popular at the time. But once I got into college, the time commitment of studying for that versus high school it's a huge jump. So I found I didn't have the same kind of free time that I did earlier on. And yeah, I kind of let it go for a few years there. I did actually have a station set up in college. The place that I was living, I had my dad's HW8 actually, and I set up a dipole down there. But I was living in a trailer park there in town, and the man-made interference, the noise level was pretty high where I was at. So it was pretty rough going. I didn't do a lot of that operating while I was down there. But yeah, once I got out of college and got married, got moved back up here, it's one of those things where suddenly I realized that not only did I have the time again, but also suddenly I have some more income to pursue.
That certainly makes a difference.
Boy, that makes all the difference in the world. So that really opened up some opportunities to get back into what I'd like to be doing.
Well, it seems to me that moving back to the hometown and pursuing your life the way that you're pursuing it, that you could have made the step to buy major ICOM, Yaesu, Elecrat, it doesn't matter which brand, but you could have outfitted your station with thousands of dollars worth of equipment, but instead you took a different path. What path did you choose to take in order to outfit your shack?
Well, I'd always been interested in home brewing. And again, backtracking just a little bit, when I was in middle school, high school, we had stacks of QSTs around the house. Dad would bring them home from work, and we bought them at Hamfest when we went. That was always something I was looking for. So I jokingly tell people I think I've read just about every Doug DeMall article that's ever been written. But I used to build all kinds of little bitty QRP rigs and little receivers and things like that on little 2x3 scraps of PC board. And most of them didn't work. Most of them were complete failures. But that was always something that I was interested in. And so got out and got the job and had the income and the time. And I don't say that it was because of COVID, but I think COVID accelerated the process, that especially around COVID, my work schedule changed briefly at the time, and I had more time at home, like a lot of people did. And so about that time, I stumbled across an article on a little regen receiver, and I'd built some regens before, and I like regen receivers. That's always been a favorite passion of mine. So I said, I haven't done this in a while. I've got some time. I'm going to get back into this. So that kind of started it, and it kind of snowballed from there. It starts with one regen, and then you think, that was fun. And about that time is also when I discovered the Solder Smokes podcast, Bill and Pete. And I realized after listening to a few episodes of them that I'd missed some things while I was in college. Notably, the SI5351 came out, and that was a huge revelation when I discovered that. That's I don't know if we can overstate what a game changer that has been for me, at least in the homebrew world.
Well, I think that's the synthesizer chip, and I think that along with Arduino for controlling it is a game changer in the homebrew world. So do you follow Pete Giuliano, who is the co-host of the Solder Smoke podcast? Do you follow his building method where you build in modules from the amplifier back? I think audio amplifier back.
I do build in modules, build a stage at a time. I don't always start with the audio amplifier the way that he does. Usually I like to start with the oscillator, whether that be an analog oscillator if I'm going that route, or usually it's the digital route, like you say, the Arduino and SI5351. But yes, I very much do try to build in modules and check them out as I go. And there's nothing worse than building up an entire board with all the modules tacked together in one big thing, one big rat's nest, and then you plug it in and nothing happens and you don't know where to start. And I've been there, done that. That's not a mistake you want to make. So it's one of those lessons you learn the hard way.
So that's one of the things we'll recommend, is that anybody who likes to build anything should listen to the Solder Smoke podcast as well. And Pete Giuliano, who I interviewed, and I'll put a link in the show notes page and include his call sign because off the top of my head I can't remember it.
N6QW.
N6QW. Okay, so Pete has always recommended that you build each stage of something on its own board so that if it works, then you actually have a working circuit for other projects that you're going to build. So you're not always redesigning the board from scratch. So I highly recommend the Solder Smoke podcast. It's one of my go-to favorites in addition to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Okay, so Will, tell us, what was the first major homebrew project that you started after returning to your hometown? You're married, you've got your own workbench now. What did you build?
Well, I built that regen, and that was an 80-meter regen that I built. And so I said, well, I need a transmitter to go with it. And so, I just found out about the SI5351, and I'd never really done any Arduino programming. My programming background in high school was actually, in 2012, it was QBasic. If you remember QBasic, the old Windows DOS Space Basic. So we were a little bit behind the times in what we were teaching then. But I ordered an SI5351, ordered an Arduino, and started working on that. And it's not particularly hard. It's a simplified C code. It's pretty easy to pick up, and especially with all the source code and examples. And also about this time is when I found Charlie Morris at Z02CTM. And of course, he's done a lot of amazing work with the SI5351 and very generous in sharing his source code and schematics and things of that nature. And so the first rig that I built after that regen was a little Class C 80-meter CW transmitter that had the SI5351 for the VFO. And that was a really good project to get my feet wet in that. I learned some, basic things like how you key it and things of that nature. And just kind of getting back into the building process. I never made a contact with that rig. It didn't have a good 80-meter antenna, and I ended up tearing it apart not long after I built it. But that was kind of my segue intro back into it. And that was about the time that I actually started working on my current main homebrew rig that I use as my primary rig now, which is the combination 5-band receiver and transmitter that I have pictures of on the QRZ page.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player, link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. Are there other hams that inspire you in terms of receiver design, for example?
Oh, absolutely. I mentioned that I think I've read every Doug DeMaul article he ever published in QST. But Wes Hayward has been a huge inspiration for me, not only in his projects and his schematics, but also the ugly building style. I am a huge disciple of the ugly building method that he kind of pioneered with his son. The Ugly Weekender, I think, was a pretty popular article that made the rounds back in the late 80s, I believe it was, where he kind of described this point-to-point wiring where you build across a ground plane, just blank PCB board, and try to keep your lead short, and you just build directly on top. And, of course, that spawned all kinds of other building methods, the Manhattan method, where you have the pads, and then, of course, me pads came after that, and things of that nature that Rex Harper does. And those are great. I've seen some beautiful builds with that. Dave Richards, AA7EE, I believe is his call sign, that does some beautiful homebrew builds with the pads and Manhattan style. That's never been me. I gave up a long time ago on trying to build nice looking builds. I settle for functional. If it works, that's really all I'm looking for. But yes, Wes Hayward has been a huge inspiration, and he's another one that I won't say I've read everything he's ever written, but I've read a lot of stuff that he's written, and he's been a huge inspiration for me.
So the current rig is what? I think I saw a picture of it on QRZ.
Yeah, so the current rig is I call it a trans receiver. And if you've read the old solid state design for the radio amateur published by ARRL way back, Wes Hayward actually had a project in the back of that book where he built a trans receiver, not a transceiver, but it's a receiver that has a transmitter that I think in his they shared a VFO. I don't remember exactly his exact setup, but they're in two separate boxes. And so it's kind of a modular design where you can swap different elements out. And so after building that 80-meter transmitter, like I say, I started working on the receiver. And it started out as a superhet receiver, single conversion, based on a design by Todd, VE7BPO. He used to run the old KI4POV website, which you can still find online. He's got a new version of that now, but his older website is still available through the web archive. You can download the whole thing as a PDF. And he had a receiver called the Popcorn QRP Superhet receiver, I believe is what he called it. And it was a simple single conversion 40-meter receiver. And, of course, he used an analog VFO, and I think he had a 4 megahertz IF in it. And so I took that and used that as the basis and started building it that way. So the first thing I knew I wanted to do was I swapped out the analog VFO and BFO with the SI5351. And, of course, with that, you get 3 channels of output. So that let me do both oscillators in one easy solution. So I didn't have to worry about crystals for the BFO or anything like that. I had 9 megahertz crystals, so I swapped out the IF frequency, moved that up a little bit. It kind of snowballed. It started out I was going to build for 40 meters. And then I thought, well, I like 20 too. It'd be neat if I had 20. So then I started looking for options for band switching, which of course with a digital VFO solution is easy. That part's not hard. All you have to do is switch the filter in the front end. And so I ended up ordering Hans Summers from QRP Labs makes a really nice filter board, filter switching board where it has 5 banks where you can put 5 different bandpass filters in there and switch them from an Arduino rather. I ended up ordering that and building it, and then I said, well, I've got 5 banks, I might as well use them. So what I ended up with when it was all said and done was a super het receiver that covers 80, 40, 30, 20, and 15. So I've got 5 bands there. And that was really the first big homebrew project that I built. And I don't necessarily recommend starting with something like that. I've had people email me that have seen my QRZ page and seen some of the things, and they say, oh, I want to build that. And, I tell them, you can start with that. I did, but it was a long process. It took me the better part of a year just to put that receiver together. And especially I ended up adding AGC to it. And I did that with a pin diode attenuator that I pulled out of EMRFD. So getting everything to play together and getting that all put together was a process. But it was a lot of fun. I learned a ton from the project. I really enjoyed it. But yeah, I got that receiver put together. And of course, get a receiver, then you need a transmitter. So ended up building a 5-band transmitter to go with it. Again, use the same filter bank board to switch filters. And the transmitter, opposed to the receiver, is very simple, actually. All that is the SI5351 for frequency control, and then I'm just running that into a 74HC04 hex inverter, and I'm just using that as a buffer amplifier, and that feeds a Class C amplifier, which my powerful Class C amplifier that I'm running in my rig is 3 2 and 22 22As running in parallel in Class C. So the transmitter is super simple. You can put one of those together in a couple of days, and that was not hard at all. But the real magic between the two that makes it work is, of course, they're both running separate VFOs. There's a whole separate Arduino SI5351 unit for the transmitter and the receiver. So, of course, then you have the problem of, well, you're tuning the receiver. How do you get your transmitter matched up? How do you net the two? And if you look back at some of the old twin sets, like the Collins twins or the ASU twins and things like that, they had all kinds of interesting solutions on how they did that. But what I ended up doing, since you have an Arduino there, that makes it a lot simpler. I actually ran a serial line between the two MCUs, between the two Arduinos. And as it's running, the receiver is the master unit. It's always feeding its frequency output over to the transmitter. And so all you have to do is flip a switch, and as you tune the receiver, the transmitter will follow you. And of course, you can unsync that if you want to work split or something like that. You could turn that off and tune the two independently. But in its default mode, they're both tuned from the receiver. And of course, I've got the offset built in, the 700 hertz offset for CW to make that work. And that was a process too, getting all that up and running. But that was a really neat project. Another one that I learned a lot from, and getting the code up and running. So it was a neat project. I learned a lot of hardware skills, but I also learned a lot of software skills to get all that put together.
That's better than college, perhaps, in terms of you're trying to start your project from scratch, make the design, acquire all of the parts, the trial and failure. Did you fail fast and often?
Absolutely. I've failed so many times, and there were times when I'd have to just walk away from it. And my wife would tell you that I was notorious for walking away frustrated, and she could always tell. She knew when it wasn't working. She'd say, "It's not working right, is it?" And I said, "Nope." And I'd go walk away from it, get in the shower for a while, and all of a sudden I'd jump out. "Oh, I know what it is. I know what it is." And you go running back in there. And I think she got pretty frustrated sometimes when I was in there working late trying to get something put together. But it was a lot of failure, a lot of learning the hard way. But like I said, it was a lot of fun. If it worked the first time, what fun would that be?
That's certainly true. I have blood in all of my projects. For some reason, I always slip with the tool and it goes through my finger or something like that. So I always know that I'm doing the right thing when there's at least a few milliliters of blood in every project. Okay, so now you've built this equipment. You built this 5-band transmitter receiver. Are you an operator? Do you build and move on to the next one, or do you build and spend a little bit of time with it on the air to see whether or not you've actually accomplished what you meant to do?
I would love to tell you that I'm an operator. And when I was spending all that year and a half or so putting that station together, I thought, oh, if I can just get this together, I'm going to operate. That's all I want to do is just get this together and be able to get on the air and say the rig here is homebrew, which, that's a great feeling. That's a really cool thing to be able to say that. But once you get at that building bug, it's just hard to get that out of your system. So I operate some. I try to get on the air a couple times a week, at least 2 or 3 times a week. When I'm working on something, I tend to operate more actually because I operate as part of the test process. But no, generally I'm a builder. As much as I would like to say that I get on and operate frequently, I really don't. If I get on once or twice a week, that's really good for me. Most of the time is spent with a soldering iron rather than a key.
What kind of test equipment do you have on your workbench?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You're a new generation of home builder. I mean, my generation, I've been doing this for now, maybe I'm as old as your father, which means that I have very heavy Hewlett-Packard test equipment on my bench. But I think that you have options available to you now that are probably considerably less big and expensive. So what is on your bench?
I wish I was heavy in Hewlett-Packard equipment. I've lusted over plenty of it at Hamfest. No, I've got a pretty simple bench overall. Main test equipment, I've got an old Tektronix. It's a TDS 2002. It's one of the little lunchbox scopes. It's a digital scope, and that's a 50 megahertz scope, so it's not particularly high bandwidth, but it plenty for all I need. I don't really do VHF. All I'm doing is HF work, and it's fine. Of course, multimeter, I use a grid dip oscillator some. Even now, that's still a handy thing to have around. Really, the big game changer, I think, that would separate my test bench from one 30, 40 years ago. And this is going to be a little polarizing, maybe. I know that people have different feelings on this, but the Nano VNA, I think, has been a huge game changer. I can't imagine building what I build and doing what I do without having the Nano VNA. That's maybe the single biggest thing that I use. And like anything else, like a scope or any other bit of test equipment, you really have to know what it's telling you and how to use it and how to interpret what you're seeing. But if you can do that, especially for things like building filters, I build my own crystal filters and bandpass filters and low-pass filters and things like that. And if you go back and look at the old articles and how you used to have to match crystals and do things like that, that was a huge ordeal to put those things together. And having the Nano VNA sitting there and being able to see that in real time as you're tweaking things and see the bandpass and what that looks like change in front of you is so nice. I could go on about it, but yeah, really my test equipment is a scope, Nano VNA. I've got a tiny SA. I haven't gotten really into using that a whole lot yet, but that's a neat tool. And multimeter. Those are the ones that I use the most.
Do you have a favorite brand of tools? When I was a kid, everybody had Exolite. It was either Exolite or Sears Craftsman, because Craftsman had a lifetime warranty.
I've got some old Craftsman tools, and I like them. But no, I'm chronically cheap. I'm really, really cheap in some of what I build. I shouldn't be. I should buy better tools. But I tend to buy a lot of Harbor Freight stuff, especially for small bench tools, the little nippers, pliers, Julier screwdrivers, things like that. I think Harbor Freight gets a bad rap. Honestly, most of what I get from there is pretty good, and they've got a decent warranty. So buy good tools, but I don't.
But probably what you're doing, you're not breaking tools. It's not like if you're pulling the engine from your car, that the crescent or open-end wrenches or box-end wrenches that you're buying don't break under the torque. But for working on electronics, probably what you get at Harbor Freight is actually pretty good. I would think that the quality of the wire snippers, if the edges are soft, then you get holes in the end. But that's usually where I'm looking at Exolite or something like that.
To some extent, my wire nippers are actually Craftsman. I do have an old set of those, but I'm not cutting really thick wire. So my hookup wire that I use for all of my builds is I look for Cat5 Ethernet cable, and I strip the insulation off, and I pull the wire out of that. It's stranded wire, which is not really ideal for what I'm doing. Solid would do better, but I can find the Ethernet cable, Cat5 cable for free just about anywhere. People are always throwing it away. So again, I'm really cheap.
I am too. I might share this with you if it's even still possible. But what I use for hookup wire is the 50-pair 1A2 cable that was used for telephone systems. So if you have old buildings in Huntsville where perhaps there might be 10, 20-foot runs of this still stuck in the risers, but it hasn't been ripped out yet by some copper dealers, then that makes amazing. 22 gauge solid, if you can find it. I always look for it, and when I find it, I buy it, borrow it.
Sure. I've got some pieces of that, and that's really nice. The Ethernet's easier to find, so that's what I tend to use most of. But yeah, that's good. You know, you're talking about tools. There are places where I don't want to skimp. There are places where it matters what you get. So I think if you're talking in terms of tools and getting good stuff, the soldering iron is probably where I would say don't compromise if we're giving advice on that. Get a good soldering iron.
What do you use?
So my current soldering iron is a Hakko. Hakko, H-A-K-K-O. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it's a basic iron. I believe this is a FX888D. I've got it sitting beside me here. It's not a particularly fancy iron, but it's got a great tip, and it heats up really fast. It's a great tool. That's the tool that I have in my hand most, and so that's where I would say you really want a good iron with good temp control and a really fine tip that you can get in and do fine work. And it's easy to swap tips out if I need to do something heavier, if I'm working on a big piece of board that's soaking up heat and I need to really heat it up. I even have multiple irons. At times I keep 2 irons on the bench. I have a big 50-watt iron that I'll use for heavier stuff, and then I have my little Hakko pencil iron that I use for finer work. But that is one place where it really makes sense to spend a little more and get a good quality tool. And of course, you don't have to get a Hakko. Weller makes a great iron, and there are a few other companies I think out there that make really nice stuff. But it's worth spending $100 there. And you know, I've talked to people before about what you spend on home brewing versus what you spend buying a rig. You mentioned earlier the idea of buying a Elecraft or a 7300 or something like that. And I've toyed with the idea of trying to sit down and write it out on paper and do a budget list or something like that. But I really do believe that you can build a nice station, and that's buying the tools, putting it together, buying the parts and everything for about the same price as you would spend on a really nice rig. Now, you would spend a lot more time, but that's, maybe that's part of the fun. But you don't have to spend a fortune. I've probably got, here at my desk, I've maybe got $500 in tools and equipment and things like that sitting here. So, that sounds like a lot, but when you look at the price of new rigs, it's really not a huge investment for a hobby that I plan to be in for the rest of my life, Lord willing.
What do you use for desoldering?
I don't have a desoldering method.
Is that a problem?
Yeah, it's a problem. I don't have a method that I like. Mainly what I use is just a soldering iron and pliers and tweezers and picks to try to carefully pull things up. Solder braid works nice. I have some of the solder suckers, so they're just little vacuum jobs. They're not the electrical ones. It's just the one that has the plunger that you push down. And those work okay, especially if you've got a lot of solder you need to remove. But that is one of the tools that I would like to add to the bench at some point, is one of those electrical desoldering guns, especially because I still like to take things apart and scrap parts off of consumer electronics. And so pulling ICs especially is really a chore. It's pretty hard to do without something like that. So that's something that I'm looking to add to the bench.
Are you doing any SMD where you might be using hot air or something like that, as more and more parts, transistors, resistors, things like that are surface mount?
I have not gotten into SMD yet. That's something that I'm going to have to do eventually. I think all of us who are homebrewers are going to eventually have to make that jump. I know Nick Kennedy at WA5BDU, I believe is his call sign. I think you've interviewed him before, but Nick does a lot of surface mount work and does really, really nice work. So I'm always impressed by people who can do that. One of my long-term goals is to learn the KI4POV and start doing my own PC board design. And if and when I get to that point, it makes sense to make the jump to surface mount. And that would open up a lot of doors for being able to use some parts that I can't use right now just because they're not available in through-hole. But I've resisted up until this point. I love ugly construction just because of its speed and versatility and being able to quickly prototype something and try it out. And that's just, you don't get that option with surface mount. That's not something you can do there. So I've got banks and banks of parts. I've got tons of drawers down here of parts, and so I'm going to hold on to through-holes I think as long as I can. But that is something I eventually want to make the jump into to some extent anyway.
What are you doing with CW ops?
So that was something that I got into back when I kind of got back into ham radio after college. Is I was getting back into building and getting back on the air, and I pretty quickly realized that I was rusty and didn't didn't have my code speed up where I wanted it to be. And I started looking around for different options of getting that back up to speed. And I don't remember exactly how I found CW Academy, but I found a page talking about the CW Academy, and I said, what's that? And I got to looking into it. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a program that the CW Ops organization runs where they teach CW to anybody who's interested, and it's free, which is the amazing part. And you sign up for it, and there is a waiting list. It's a pretty popular program. But you get into this once you get on the waiting list, and you're assigned to an instructor and a co-instructor. And usually you meet 1 or 2 nights a week, and that's via Zoom or Skype or something of that nature. You get on the computer, and they help you learn CW. And so they have different levels. They have a beginning and an intermediate and an advanced course based on where you're starting from, if you have some background versus no background. And they can take you from 5 words a minute all the way up to 25 plus, which I believe is their goal. I think it's 25 words a minute is what they consider competency for being part of CW Ops. So I got into the intermediate program and had a great experience. That was such a neat program. And it's amazing that they just do that for free and offer that to the public. And really, really enjoy that and met some neat people. It's very effective. They were able to take me from about 13 words a minute, and at my peak, I was able to comfortably work over 25. And so that was when I was able to actually join CW Ops. Of course, to do that, you have to be nominated by a couple of other current members and be able to demonstrate competency at that speed level. And so I was able to do that, and that was a really neat process that I really enjoyed. Again, I would like to say that I kept that up and stayed with it. I'll occasionally get back into some of the CW contests that they do, but honestly, I don't do a lot with it anymore. I'm mostly on the building side, but that's something that I recommend to anybody who wants to get into CW is look into the CW Ops, CW Academy. That's a great program to learn CW, to build your CW speed and competency. They, along with Long Island CW Club, are doing some amazing work in bringing people in. And it's been really neat to see how many people are getting into that and interested. Even now that they've dropped the code requirement, there are still a huge number of people who are getting into the code and wanting to learn that. So that's pretty cool.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. Now, I apologize for asking the question, but anybody that's my age is sitting there listening to this conversation. I'm talking to a guy that's in his early 30s, right?
I turned 30 last year.
New family. How do you negotiate with the new wife, relatively new wife, the time to do a hobby? Because I think that most people say, oh, my professional career and with children and everything like this, it's overwhelming, and so I just don't have time to pursue a hobby. But it sounds to me like to have a workbench and a place to work, and that this is a priority, or it seems to be a priority in your life, but it also seems to me that your spouse has also decided that that's important for you. How did you work that out, can I ask?
Yeah, she is very, very understanding. I think she would tell you and she knows that it's good for my mental well-being to have some project time every now and again to just have some time to sit down at the bench and unwind. But it's all about priorities and keeping things in their proper place. And so for a lot of those projects that I was describing earlier, the big transmitter receiver project, that was before kids. And so at the time we were both working, and she's a chemistry teacher is her background. And so she had a lot of time working on grading papers and lesson plans and things like that. And so our nightly routine was that she would sit down at her desk and at the time in the house we were living in, her desk and my desk were right beside each other. So we were sitting in the same room, and she would sit there and work on her stuff, and I would sit there and work on mine for an hour or two a night. And that worked out very well for our schedule at that point. I have a 10-month-old son now, so that's really changed.
The dynamic.
That changed the dynamic a lot.
We started at 5 in the morning your time so that you could get this interview in before your child wakes up.
Yes. And so these days, the project time tends to be late at night. He goes to bed pretty early right now, and so after we get him to bed and get other things knocked out, sometimes I can get it in 30 minutes to an hour, after 9 o'clock or something like that. I can come in here and sit down and work for a little while. But that's something that's evolving continually as I move forward, and especially as he continues to get older and his needs and wants change. That's something that I'm trying to negotiate, because I don't want to let radio take a place that it doesn't need to. I want to keep, my priorities, personally are God first, and family, and then job and career, and then hobbies and things like that come afterwards. So it's something that I'm constantly working, trying to keep in its proper place.
It sounds to me like you're doing an amazing job. I think you'd agree that spending an hour, even an hour and a half a night on any project, you can really move quite rapidly through a project if you're actually dedicating a regular time every day. You
can. It depends on the type of project. So I actually just finished up, my most recent project was a 30-meter transceiver that I just got done over the weekend, actually. We had a rainy weekend, and I got a little extra project time to knock that out. But the way my projects tend to work is I'll make really good progress if I'm doing an hour a night, just plugging right along, and then I get hung on something. And so for this particular project, I got hung up on the side tone injection of all things. You would think getting side tone injection that's just one of those final details that you stick in there before you button the whole thing up and call it done. And I spent over a month trying to get the side tone injection like I wanted, and getting side tone clean, and trying different things. And so, usually I make pretty good progress, but it's one of those things that you hit snags, and sometimes you just have to put it down and walk away from it for a little while, and then you have an idea and you come back to it later and try something else, and you just kind of keep coming back to it until you find something that you like, something that works.
And so is that process of, like, for example, solving that problem with side tone injection, was that problem resolved by more research online, YouTube videos, a combination of everything, going back to the books? How did you resolve that problem ultimately? Or was it just really a thought experiment?
All of the above. So it's looking at what other people have done. You go back and look at old schematics, but also just kind of thinking through, and a lot of it is just troubleshooting and figuring out where the problem is. I think one of the biggest skills is being able to identify and isolate what's causing your problem in the first place. And so just basic things like signal tracing. If you have a probe where you can go through and say, okay, it sounds good here, but it doesn't sound good here, so the problem is somewhere in this area, you start narrowing it down. But also having good people to talk to. So none of this happens in a bubble. I've talked about all these projects that I've done, and it sounds like I did it in isolation, but that's certainly not the case. I've had good resources and good people to talk to. My dad being one of them, obviously. He's a huge resource for me, but also there are communities now. And that's one of the things I think that makes homebrew so exciting now, is that you can reach out to some of these people that really are smart and really know what they're doing, which I don't consider myself one of those, but people like Nick Kennedy or Jerry, KI4POV, or there's plenty of others that I correspond with on a pretty regular basis through some of the online forums and things like that. And just being able to bounce ideas off of them and see what they're thinking, that's a huge resource.
What is Club 100 and Model T computing?
That's a throwback.
Is that something you're still doing?
No, that's not something I'm still associated with, but that is a group for the Tandy Model 102, which is one of the first laptops. It's a TRS laptop that came out. And I don't know if people have seen that before, but it actually ran a version of DOS, and it had an LCD screen that was about 2 by 6 or something like that, 2 inches by 6 inches, and had a really nice little keyboard on it. That was a little computer that I picked up at the Huntsville Hamfest back when I was in high school, and started doing research on it. And I still got it. I don't do a lot with it anymore, but one of my side hobbies is I've dabbled in retro computing, so I've got that, and I've had some other TRS-80s and an Apple II and some things like that.
I have an original Toshiba laptop, DOS laptop, with a 30 meg hard drive. It had a beautiful blue LCD screen and wonderful keyboard, but for some reason, I just can't get it to operate anymore. I'm wondering whether or not there's a place for that. I guess I should probably do some Googling to see whether or not there's any groups that resurrect. This was one of the first DOS laptops that was maybe consumer size beyond the luggy. First portable computers were actually desk computers with a handle on them. But it brings back memories. Okay, what excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now, if you're scanning the horizon?
There's just so many opportunities, and there's so much out there now. And that's always been the case, but maybe more so now than ever. And I tend to have tunnel vision because I spend most of my time in the homebrew sphere. But there are so many opportunities now in homebrew in terms of parts that are available, but also resources and people that are out there that you can network with and talk to, and projects that are available. I look back at the old days when you had, your only resources for building some of this stuff were the QST articles, or maybe you had a book from the ARRL, like a solid state design or something like that. And those are great resources. Still, if you have a chance to pick those up, do that. But it's come so far now, and being able to just get online and get all that stuff for free, it's all out there, just free for the taking. It really is more accessible now than it's ever been, which is really a shame because I think maybe it may be less popular now than it's ever been, but it's never been easier to get into. And so that's really what excites me. And if I can share just kind of a little side story. So the rig that I built, the transceiver rig, I took that to FDIM last year. That was my first time going to Dayton. And me and my dad went up there, and I entered that in their homebrew competition. They have a little competition on Friday night at FDIM where you can bring homebrew gear and kind of show it off and just talk to people. And of course, you have a room full of guys who are interested in things like that, walking around just looking. And I think one of the neatest things that I had said to me that night as people were walking by and looking at it was I had a guy that came up and looked at it, and he was looking over, and I had the cover off of it so you could see the ugly construction board. And of course, all the rigs around are these beautiful, beautiful homebrew projects that are just gorgeous. I mean, they've got immaculate boards on the inside and super nice, well-fitted cases and things like that. And he looked at mine and he said something to the effect of, he said, I think I could do this. He said, all these others look like something that's out of reach, but I look at yours and this just looks like something you went and put together from Home Depot or something like that. I think, yeah, that's exactly what it is. It really doesn't have to be anything particularly hard. It doesn't have to be anything particularly fancy. You can put together a very nice working rig with just basic stuff. Yeah, I guess that's what excites me now. It's just all the resources and opportunities that are available to the aspiring homebrewer.
I think you put a YouTube video on your QRZ page to a guy that actually is making his own cabinets, folding metal. Do you fold your own metal from Home Depot in order to make the cases for your rigs?
I do. If you start looking at aluminum cases on Amazon or somewhere like that, they're pretty expensive. It's not cheap to buy project boxes, especially, bud boxes and things like that have gotten very expensive. And so what I've discovered is you can buy sheet aluminum from Lowe's or Home Depot or somewhere like that. And it's about 2 feet by 3 feet or something like that. And it's a pretty good size sheet. And for about $50 or so, you can get a sheet of that. And then I take 10 snips and I draw out my outline for whatever size case that I want. And I cut that out with 10 snips. And it's not a perfect solution. Of course, if you start looking at it, they're not perfectly square. And it's not the most rugged box. I tell people it's not something that I would take out if I were doing soda or POTA or something like that. But I'm not. I'm a bench operator if I'm operating at all. And so for sitting on an operating bench and just having a box to put it in, that works very well. And it allows me to build the case to whatever size or dimensions that I want. And that's really the main thing is because I'm home brewing and using odd sized boards and things like that, sometimes I need a kind of odd sized box to to fit my project. And so I can do that. That's pretty easy to do, to size it to whatever size that I need.
As a younger ham, I mean, you might be considered a juvenile based on the average age of ham radio operators these days. Do you have any sense, if you were marketing to younger people younger than yourself, do you have any marketing sense that would tell you what the messages are that should go out to them in order to draw them into ham radio? I don't think any of us old-timers have figured that one out.
I'm not going to pretend like I have all the answers to that. I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right, is how do we get younger people into it? I mentioned going to FDIM in Dayton last year. That was a great experience, but wow, you start looking around, and it's a graying hobby. It really is. I don't know. I think I try to look back and think of, well, what was it that drew me in? What was it that was neat to me? And I think for me, it was shortwave. I still think shortwave is magic, just being able to listen to other parts of the world and hear that coming in through a wire with no connection. I'm afraid that that's lost on people now just because the prevalence of the internet. And you know, and I know that that's not the same thing, that being able to hear it wirelessly with just a very simple handful of parts is very different than having a computer with all the backbone and infrastructure of the internet. But I don't know if people see that and appreciate the difference. I think from my opinion, if you want to get younger people in, we have to emphasize the technical side. And I think where it could be marketed is in high schools and physics class and things like that, in showing that it's an opportunity to apply and get hands-on with some of the things that you're learning. And one of the things that I think makes amateur radio really unique is that it's an experimenter's license. And so if you look at other radio services like CB or FMRS or GRS or some of these others, they allow you to do maybe some of the same things. But one of the things that sets amateur radio apart is the idea that you can modify and build and tinker. Whereas the way the FCC rules read with CB and things like that, you're not supposed to mess with the radios. You know, it's just a ready-made unit that you put on the air, and that's supposed to be all you do with it. Of course, that's not always how that works. But you know, I think it's Ireland maybe that has the language in their licensing system that they actually call their amateur radio license a radio experimenter's license, and I like that concept that it's a license to experiment and apply some of these things. And so I think if we want to market this to younger people, one of the big opportunities is getting into high schools and showing them the opportunities to apply some of these things. And that's not just hardware. My projects these days, you know, as much as I like Oakley construction, things like that, it's about 50-50 of software versus hardware. A lot of the time that I spend in homebrewing is spent at the computer working on code and showing them that this is a way to get involved with things like Arduino and sensors and things like that and apply some of that, and making sure that we're embracing that and marketing this as a way to exercise some of those things in a real world environment. To me, I think that's one of the ways that we could be doing better in marketing it to young people.
Well, I think that's a fine answer. I have to tell you, what struck me about this conversation was how important the role that your father played in keeping you in the envelope. So I'm thinking of the small workbench and him bringing stuff home for you to take apart and to experiment. So he started this whole tinkering, experimenting mode when you were quite young and impressionable. I get the impression perhaps that piece is missing, that perhaps what a lot of young people are missing are mentors.
I think you're right. And I'll say something else is that when I was a kid, I had time to do stuff like that. So we didn't do a lot of organized sports. I didn't play ball or things like that. We weren't involved in something after school every day. I did band in high school, but that was really the only extracurricular I had. And so the product of that was I had a lot of time at home to focus on hobbies and activities and things like that, and to get interested in things like that. I had the time and the space to pursue those sorts of things. And so the combination of time and then the encouragement and the help from my parents to get interested in things like that was a huge game changer for me as well.
What advice would you give then to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I mean, my gut reaction is to say build something. And I hesitate a little bit on that because the fact of the matter is ham radio is a big hobby, and it's not everybody's cup of tea to homebrew and do what I do. And that's okay. There's lots and lots of avenues and different things that you can pursue within radio as a whole. And that's great. I have nothing against, any of that, but I do think I have to stick with the idea, get technical with it. Wherever level you're at right now, try to level up in your technical ability and technical knowledge. And that could look a lot of different ways, but there's nothing like the magic of listening to a station on a receiver that you built yourself. A simple direct conversion receiver is magic. There's nothing better than putting it on the air and listening to somewhere far off on just a collection of parts that you scrounged up and soldered together at your bench. So I build something, I think, is where I've got to go. Build something.
A lot of self-fulfillment comes from that too, right?
Absolutely.
You can do it. Will, what a pleasure to speak to you about your ham radio life. I guess it's relatively short as it is compared to all of the old timers that are in ham radio now. I hope to meet you at FDIM the next time I'm there. That's actually my favorite event at Hamvention is FDIM when I go. And I love to see what people are building. And I realize, when you're looking into some of these chassis where they've spent months on KiCad and other stuff, sending iterations of boards from China and all this stuff, that you can make an absolutely beautiful project. But I think, it starts with a dirty construction mode. At some point, you got to do that too in order to get, at least that's how I homebrew everything, on a plug board first, and then I put it on a dirty construction with everything flying around it before I get to KiCad. So I see all of the iterations, but I like going to FDI for that reason, just to see what people are thinking is important and in construction and how it's done, and it's great to brag. I don't have any bragging rights, but you now have bragging rights, and I think that that's a wonderful thing. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73. Thank you for coming on QSO today.
Thank you so much, Eric. 73 to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Will. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KI4POV in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.